Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sofia Sprechmann-Sinedo, and I'm the Secretary General of CARE International, and I'm on the board of the International Budget Partnership. The International Budget Partnership, or IBP, partners with budget analysts, community organizers, and advocates working across the world to advance public budget systems that work for all people. Together, we generate data, advocate for reform, and build the skills and knowledge of people so that everyone can have a voice in budget decisions that impact their lives. It is my pleasure and honor to be the moderator of this important event to launch the Open Budget Survey 2021. This event is being conducted with interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. Please press the interpretation language button on your screen and select the language in which you want to listen to the discussion. We are delighted to have with us today leaders from government and civil society to speak to how investing in accountable public finance systems can be a winning proposition that helps countries better manage scarce resources and rebuild the social contract between state and citizens. We will have a keynote address from a leading social activist in India. We will have the results from the 120 countries of the Open Budget Survey and a high-level panel discussion. We encourage you to join the conversation via Twitter at Open Budgets or #OpenBudgets. And we aim, of course, to address questions during the event today and also afterward. We now turn to our keynote speaker, Aruna Roy, the world-renowned social activist from India, to deliver a keynote address. This will be followed by a presentation by Anjali Garg, and finally, we'll move into a high-level discussion with reformers. Aruna, it's an honor, and over to you.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, IBP. It's a pleasure and it's wonderful to be with all of you again. 30 years ago, I represent the Workers and Peasants Organization in India. It began fighting for the access to information and really related to the livelihoods and lives of very poor people, and we came up with two very important slogans. The first one in our language said, "Hum janenge, hum jiyenge," which translates as the right to know is the right to live. And the other one, "Hamara paisa, hamara hisab," which went all over the country, translates into "our money is our accounts." So in a sense, these are central to democratic participation and for access to justice and information. 11 years ago, I came to Dar es Salaam to deliver a keynote to IBP inspired by these two slogans and the relevance it has had in a world beset by inequality and injustice cannot be emphasized. And with the growing hunger for democratic participation and the equally repressive regimes that we are all facing, these two slogans have gained in importance and relevance. I return to this forum in a markedly more hostile world to say that the transparency and accountability movement I represent and the budget transparency forum I'm speaking at, these principles have become even more critically relevant today. With the results of the Open Budget Survey 2021 that you have circulated to all of us, we have a quick review of where we stand with these two very essential principles, the right to know and the consequent right to live. Because I do believe that budgets are not esoteric pieces of information. They relate directly to people's lives, the money that is going to be allocated to us, and whether we survive or don't. And it's extremely important that we understand it. Contemporary democracy has, however, pitched in a remarkably short time from a positive trend towards creative efforts on open governments and citizen-centric governance to an era of sharp reversal with opaqueness, evasion, and surveillance disabling the democratic rights of citizens. It has happened in my country and is happening in democratic countries all over the world. The suppression of dissent and opposition to the invoking of draconian laws has not only led to the imprisonment of rights activists, whistleblowers, and political opponents, but it has also severely impaired the society's ability to self-correct. A decade ago, there was hope and the beginnings of a shared vision between civil society and governments, based on an understanding that democratic practice needed to become more participatory. Citizenship began to be defined and was measured through the lens of transparency, accountability, and participation. The last decade, however, has witnessed the emergence of transparency and accountability systems evolved diligently by civil society formations to evolve inclusive systems to deliberate and reduce inequalities being threatened. Progressive formations such as the IBP and the OGP, which emerged and gave direction to progressive political governments which supported them, was a beacon light. It is very important to understand that without these intelligent tools, citizens could not have worked the dream of a more equal society. The journey towards this conceptualization of citizenship has not been easy. The fear of questioning by governments and the power elites as a threat to their impunity has made many governments and leaders retract from their promises. In India, we are often fighting a battle to curtail and to limit the horizons of the Right to Information Act, which we fought for and got in 2005. They're often caught between the implicit political promise of sharing power with the vote, which they give in a democracy, and the reluctance to face public scrutiny and accountability. As contemporary events show, there are now huge challenges within countries, not to mention conflicts between countries, as in Europe, affecting and threatening democracy itself. The recent management of medical care during the pandemic has further underscored the need for greater economic sharing and for a participatory system of governance in which people have a say in the form of governance and in the delivery of basic services. The need to have universal health guarantees and information at the peak of the pandemic raised these issues to a newer level of emphasis and to emphasize the right to live. Many people lost their lives because of inadequacies of governments and not sharing information. By bringing into stark relief the effects of widening inequality and the costs of weak public accountability, the pandemic should have created a moment for collective reflection, including by those in the political establishment. Unfortunately, this has not happened. The questions often unanswered about government spending on pandemic and vaccines have underscored the need for open budgets and transparency and accountability of expenditure as never before. The pandemic has also illustrated why budgets and a survey on openness of governments will prove an important part of the capacities of civil action. The question of whether governments will invest in recovery efforts in national budgets is critical for marginalized populations. The process of how a budget is decided, whether there was public engagement to include people's opinions, and whether it delivers on promises is an evaluation of democratic governments themselves. Governments are also using digital technology as a red herring for collecting and controlling citizen information. It is no secret that from restrictions on citizens' access and phone tapping to Pegasus, technology is actually being used to control access to information from the smallest units of governance to the largest policies and laws. In the suppression of transparency, governments achieve a dual purpose: collecting data, often which cannot be scrutinized, to track in the name of national security, and combating corruption, but eventually using that information to promote private investment. Despite all the intrinsic threats to restrain access to information and transparency, governments speak a language that talks of all these rights as sacred. This double speak has to be exposed. And what better way than to look at their budgets? The fundamental right to question state spending, even through the Comptroller and Auditor General or the Supreme Audit institutions, has been compromised in many countries through collusive practices of arbitrary governance and laws which prevent scrutiny. The claim of democracy must be backed by appropriate participatory institutional structures, internally and internationally, and be open to be examined by citizens. Addressing all this, the Open Budget Survey 2021 that you have presented shows that investing in open budgets is a winning proposition. Over the last 13 years, the IBP has documented steady gains in transparency despite the pandemic and democratic headwinds. This is substantiated by a growing body of evidence that transparency, participation, and accountability in budgets in decision-making leads to lower corruption, more revenue, and better government services. In a scenario where the right to question and the right to dissent, the right to free speech and expression are all under attack, institutionalized mechanisms like the open budget become an even more vital tool. Platforms for citizen engagement are shrinking, and budgetary provisioning and the passage of laws are becoming more opaque than ever. The demand for democratic rights underscore the need for resistance and struggles as power elites switch to modes of controlling power and information. Our resistance is manifested in different ways to make sure that there is accountability of our political institutions, be they legislatures, national legislative committees, or national agencies. Placing open budget partnership in the center of this debate offers possible ethical solutions to fight the many inequalities in the world. Every tool, transparency, accountability, participation, and even technology must work for the people. As a methodology of making accountability work, the open budget has been a system of fixing veracity and systemic negligence in sectors which have traditionally been opaque or marginalized. Community participation helps reduce waste of public funds, and audits help corruption in procurement. Good budget decision-making, that is, decision-making shaped by vigorous public participation, real transparency, and active oversight, helped by all the national governments' passing of their transparency laws, helps strengthen the social contract and eliminates obstacles to the fair delivery of public services, which ultimately advances the resilience of the poor rather than the interests of the elite. Governments and oversight bodies like legislatures and auditors should in fact seek ways to bring the public in, and in so doing, invigorate democratic and open societies. Some countries are finding innovative approaches from leveraging digital technologies to garner public feedback and consultation, to working with communities to track whether services are actually reaching them. In the state where I live in India, Rajasthan, civil society and government have come together in a formal, institutionalized, regular digital dialogue to build a Jan Suchna portal. In English, a people's information portal. In the 2.5 years of its existence, it has received over 100 million visits, and there have been 125 million information downloads. This relates to granular information of all public expenditure, and it has allowed people to ensure that they receive their entitlements in real time in millions of cases. Like the expenditure portal, perhaps we should also come up with a budget and planning portal. People need to see budgets as controlling mechanisms which affect their livelihood and life. To realize the full benefits of citizen engagement, governments should establish sound public participation opportunities throughout the 4 stages of the budget cycle: formulation, approval, execution, and oversight. Government must find a way to reach out, and citizens must enforce governments to reach out and allow participation. Finally, these big questions that only economists and policymakers feel that they have the competence to discuss must be challenged. It takes us back to the 2 straightforward, simple formulations of the amazing semi-literate and illiterate women in them cases who battle with poverty every day and said that the right to know is the right to live. And budget priorities determine our right to live. What is allocated is our money, and it is therefore our accounts. We have a right to know and to decide. Democracy is first about people. The open budget survey is an exercise of our money, our budget, to enable us to know, decide, and live with equity, justice, and dignity. We have great expectations of the IBP, an institution that has taken on the responsibility to anchor this important global exercise. Despite hard times, the IBP is continuing to build solidarities using global experience. It strengthens processes such as open budgets as part of the architecture of our global democratic culture. We must, in the end, continue speaking truth to power, and open budgets are a part of this exercise. Good luck to you, good luck to ourselves, and good luck to all democracies, open budgets, open governments, and a free people. Thank you.
Thank you, Aruna, for your very powerful message, an inspiring message. Thank you for describing the headwinds against We Are Up so well. And thank you for really very clearly laying out the role of open budgets in tackling and addressing the big challenges that, again, we are up against. We now turn to Anjali Garg, the head of the Open Budget Survey at the International Budget Partnership, to hear about the Open Budget Survey findings and paths to progress. Anjali, over to you.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm delighted to launch the Open Budget Survey with our partners in 120 countries today. The latest Open Budget Survey is being released at a moment when inclusive and accountable public budgets are more urgent than ever. The pandemic has led to the first rise in global extreme poverty in a generation, and inequality is soaring. If we are to meet these challenges, governments need to open up to public dialogue around how best to manage scarce public resources. When the pandemic first broke out, we wondered whether governments would be able to maintain accountability in their annual budget processes. Yet we knew how critical open budget practices would be to ensuring relief and recovery efforts reach those most in need. At the International Budget Partnership, we have been producing the Open Budget Survey for the last 16 years, and even we were surprised by the most recent results. We found that while accountability systems around the world remain weak, the pandemic did not undo hard-fought gains in transparent and accountable budgeting practices worldwide. Most countries were able to maintain, and in some cases build, on earlier gains in accountability in their annual budget processes. Between 2019 and 2021, the global average score for transparency increased by 1 point. The global average score for oversight declined by 1 point, and the global average score for participation was unchanged. Although the survey does not explicitly examine the reasons why country practices improve or regress, we believe the resilience and durability of open budgets can be attributed to 2 factors: increased digitization of information and the institutionalization of accountability practices. In light of these somewhat surprising results, we believe investing in open budgets is a winning proposition. Over the last 13 years, we have documented steady gains in global transparency. The average transparency score in the survey has increased by more than 20% since 2008. Eastern Europe and Central Asia, East Asia and the Pacific, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Sub-Saharan Africa have all made significant strides in regional transparency scores since 2008. Reform champions worldwide, many of whom you will hear more from in our panel today, illustrate the power of political will in driving progress and demonstrate that reform is possible anywhere. The Dominican Republic has entered the top 10 performers who are leading the way in advancing and institutionalizing transparency, alongside other leaders like Georgia. Benin, Nigeria, and the Gambia are among the biggest improvers in this survey round. Many governments are also introducing innovative approaches to public participation, including using digital tools and other channels to engage with the public and be more inclusive in those engagements. Indonesia has set up a centralized portal for complaints on service delivery. Moldova and Argentina's national audit offices are testing public outreach strategies. South Korea is increasing representation from marginalized communities in its public consultations on the budget. These countries are reaping the benefits of open budgets and provide a useful roadmap for others to follow. While these positive results are heartening, we must underscore that there are important gaps in accountability systems worldwide. No country meets our minimum standards for adequate accountability on the three measures we assess. The transparency improvements we have observed come off of a low base. The average global transparency score is 45 out of 100, far from the level of information the public needs to engage in meaningful debates on how public resources are raised and spent. Less than a third of countries provide sufficiently detailed information to understand how their budgets address poverty, and only 14% of countries present their expenditures by gender. Public participation is the weakest link. The average global score for participation is just 14 out of 100, indicating that participation is scarce and meaningful participation is rare. Only 8 countries worldwide have formal channels to engage underserved communities in the budget process. Oversight systems are being compromised. The average score for legislative oversight has declined slightly to 47 out of 100 due to political unrest, the pandemic, and executive overreach. The average score for audit oversight remains unchanged at 63 out of 100, but serious challenges remain. Most executives feel little pressure to implement audit recommendations, undermining the influence of auditors. The status quo is not enough. As we look ahead, we must ask ourselves, what can we, as a network of open budget champions, do to encourage more countries to pursue paths to progress? That is why we are renewing our call to action and urging governments to publicly commit to and achieve the following goals. Renew the social contract by establishing meaningful, inclusive opportunities to engage the public across the budget process. Curtail executive overreach by improving oversight, especially during budget execution. Usher in a race to the top by disclosing more and better information on planned and executed budgets and debt and fiscal risk. Institutionalize accountability reforms as permanent features of budget systems. At the International Budget Partnership, we will do our part to provide spaces where government officials, civil society, and other practitioners can come together to engage in peer learning and advance good practices. Thanks for joining us today as we take this work forward. We invite you to read our report, interact with our data, and join our call to action by visiting our website, www.internationalbudget.org/open-budget-survey. We hope our conversation today will motivate more paths to progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali, for that very interesting summary of the findings and recommendations from the Open Budget Survey. Now we wish to engage with all of you and conduct a poll. And let's see whether the poll will come up. We would like to ask you where you most would like to see most improvements in open budgets. And hopefully the poll will come up. Wonderful. So the question is, where would you most like to see improvements in open budgets? And the options are more timely, comprehensive, accurate budget information on budget plans, more timely, comprehensive, accurate budget information on budget execution, more inclusive participation, and more robust role by legislative and national audit institutions. So let's see the results. And as you can see, execution and participation seem to be the areas where most of you think we need to make greater progress. Participation first place, and then execution. Thank you for your engagement. And as you can see the bars moving on screens, thank you very, very much. Let us now move to our panel, to our high-level panel, and hear the perspectives of several stakeholders. Before I introduce the panel, I would like to present a short video recording from Minister Zainab Ahmed, who is the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning of Nigeria. She had intended to join the panel, but was called away to another urgent event. And she was kind enough to answer a couple of questions that we have recorded. In the video that we will play, Minister Ahmed answers these two questions. What reforms have you undertaken? And what is next on your agenda as you seek to strengthen and sustain open, inclusive, and accountable budget practices? Let's see the video.
Good morning, Amslam. I'm Zainab Shamsun Ahmed, Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning. I'd like to start by ascribing the success of Nigeria and OBS to the very hard and consistent and diligent work of the DG Budget and the staff of the Budget Office, and also to the cooperation that we've been able to receive from the Parliament and also from our colleagues, ministries, departments and agencies. What have we done? Since we started working on the budget in 2015, we've done a number of reforms. The first one the very significant one, is being able to put within the government integrated financial management system a budget model, so that the budget itself is prepared on the GIFMIS system and submitted to the Budget Office on the system. What that does is it enables us to have an audit trail of all the inputs at different stages in the preparation of. So what that did immediately was to help us enhance our control on the transparency and accountability of the budget processes. And also people knowing that whatever you do on the system is traceable. It really did a lot for us. Second major achievement for us is being able to steer back the budget process from to the January to December cycle. Why that is significant is that we had experienced periods where our budgets were passed in March and sometimes in May. There was the third year that it was passed in June was really what hits the chord that we must work together with the Parliament to get the January to December budget cycle passed. But to be able to do that, we have to make sure that the medium-term expenditure framework is also prepared on time and submitted to Parliament by June, and that the budget itself, the process starts early so that by the end of September, the budget is with the Parliament. And we've been able to do that consistently for the past 3 years. And in the process of the budget and the MTEP, we consult with the public, we consult with ministries, departments, and agencies during the preparation. After the MTEP is submitted, after the budget is submitted, we also expose the budget through presentations of the MTEP and presentations of the budget to the public. That has enhanced the power of the citizens to be able to interrogate the process as well as interrogate the data that we use as a basis for the budget and even the budget itself. It's been a lot of hard work. Yes. But it's also been very beneficial and very, very interesting. So what we're really missing is an organic budget law. To be able to set up the budget office to stand on its own as an institution, and also to have a law that guides all of its actions. So right now we also have the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the Financial Regulations Act, but the budget office is not an institution of its own. And that has consequences. It means that the public service can at any time pull your staff out of position or put new staff to you, and then you're continuously trying to train people and get them up to a certain level, and after a while they move out again. So that's something we're trying to address by being able to have in place an organic budget law.
We now turned, thank you for that message from Minister Zainab Ahmed. We would now like to turn to the distinguished speakers to learn more about reforms and ways forward. And let me start with Minister José Manuel Vicente, Minister of Finance of the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic is a rare example of a country that has seen its transparency score increase in every round to a high of 77 in the latest Open Budget Survey 2021. In other countries, we have seen improvements and then regression. What lessons can you share about institutionalizing open budget practices? Over to you, Minister Vicente Duboc.
Thank you, Sophia. It's an honor for the Dominican Republic and a pride. We're very proud to have attained this score. And I would say that there are 3 main lessons or elements that all countries should keep in mind to continue advancing in the area of transparency. The first is political will. If there is no political will, it's very difficult to show progress on a topic that is so complex and delicate as the topic of budgets. The Dominican Republic, as you said in the beginning, has been improving now for several years in everything that has to do with transparency. However, COVID, the pandemic, was a big test for us because just like every other country, the priorities of the governments weren't necessarily budget priorities, but rather how to attack the pandemic. And the whole focus was on how to control the pandemic. However, in spite of this, and along with the political will that I mentioned previously, we were able to quickly implement reports on government spending and investments and everything related to COVID. And we were giving more transparency to the citizens about how the resources from their taxes are being spent, because those resources belong to the citizenry. And so the political will, again, is very important. In spite of being in the middle of a pandemic, we did not leave the issue of budget transparency aside. The second thing I would say is has to do with institutional growth, capacity building, etc. In the middle of the pandemic, we increased the frequency of our budget reports, and we had greater disaggregation. Starting from October of 2020, we implemented expenditure reports weekly, in which public expenditures were presented in the smallest detail available in all of the budget areas. And this was accompanied by greater efforts to have direct contact with the citizenry and with civil society, with the objective of increasing opportunities for these groups to participate in the process of budget formulation and to give a voice to these citizens in everything having to do with the formulation and the putting together of the budget. The third thing that I would say is very important in this significant progress that we have been able to have has to do with continuously improving and seeing how to leverage the use of technology, social media, as a way of getting to the population that uses social media frequently. And so we have adapted all of our reports so that they appear more in form of infographics that are easier to understand and that have a more, instead of the reports that are focused more economically than the idea of informing the public. And so periodically, there are gatherings where questions are taken live. And that's another way of keeping citizens informed. And I would say that with these three elements, these are the things that have helped us to have the success that we have had up till now.
Thank you very much, Minister José Manuel Vicente Duboc. And it is now my honor to turn to Minister Lasha Hutsutsvili, Minister of Finance of Georgia. Georgia is now the highest ranked country on transparency in this year's survey, and its score has increased by over 30 points since 2008. We also have seen improvement in all three pillars of our survey: transparency, oversight, and participation. What benefits, dear Minister, have you seen of open and accountable budget practices? Over to you.
Thank you for the question. Dear honored guests, dear colleagues, I'm honored to welcome you all at the global launch of the Open Budget Survey to 2021. Once more, on behalf of Georgia, we are really proud when we look back to the past we have followed up to these days, from the country with the minimal transparency in 2006 to the country which follows the standards of extensive transparency since 2017. And the latest results that ranks Georgia #1 among 120 countries. Open Budget Survey results show significant improvements even compared to the previous one, irrespective to all the restrictions linked to COVID-19, when basically we have maintained the work from home practice for our staff for almost 2 years. So the highest score which confirms the progress we have made, gives us ground to be proud, but at the same time, acknowledgement of the results we have achieved adds on to our sense of responsibility and motivation for the way forward to deal with the remaining or emerging challenges. For the past decade, Georgia has undergone through the serious reforms in public finance management. Georgia is very actively monitoring the ongoing PFM reform. Open Budget Survey regularly tracks the development. We regularly do the PEFA self-assessment, engaged in instruments like FTE and PIMA by IMF. Open Budget Survey recommendations, among others, have guided our reform agenda and still leaves room for further development, especially in citizen participation area. All the above mentioned prove that being transparent and open is priority for government of Georgia. The spread of the new coronavirus into 2020 has been the biggest challenge for the whole world and has caused significant fluctuation in the global economy. Naturally, the pandemic caused an economic recession in Georgia as well. However, it needs to be mentioned that as a result of the implemented reforms, the existing PFM performance and the budget system was flexible enough to mobilize the necessary funding in crisis situation. The organic law of Georgia on economic freedom provides for specific regulations such as triggering escape clauses related to fiscal rule limits. Mechanism for adjusting the annual budget law allows allocation to the distributed between programs and sub-programs to mobilize necessary resources, ensuring that all necessary measures are funded even before annual budget law amendment take place, but in rule-based manner. All above mentioned has led to the continuity of the budget process, related practices, even during the COVID-19 pandemic, when state of emergency was declared in the country, and while the public sector, including the Ministry of Finance, worked mainly from distance remotely. We were lucky to have been supported by international donor organizations on this road, not only financially, but also with the technical expertise. This plays a vital role in the capacity building process and ensuring that the reforms go into right direction. Let me use this opportunity to thank you, World Bank, USAID, UNDP, IMF, GIZ, UK government, and many others for the support and trust they have to our reforms.
Thank you very much, Minister Hutsisvili. And now it is our pleasure to welcome the State Secretary Vladimir Arachelov of Moldova. State Secretary Arachelov, we have seen how Moldova has newly reached the threshold of 61 points, signifying sufficient amounts of information are publicly available and can support an informed public debate on the budget. How can the government and civil society use the Open Budget Survey to guide reform efforts across the accountability ecosystem? Over to you, State Secretary.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure for me to be present at your event. On behalf of the Minister of Finance, I would like to congratulate for this event and for this interesting presentation and speakers. It was very interesting for me to share the experience among these countries. Georgia, Dominican Republic, it was a very interesting presentation, and we will consider in future in our implementing efforts of open budget. Anyway, the document presented, the Open Budget Survey, is presenting an objective assessment that could enable all involved stakeholders to have a consolidated position regarding the way the country is at some point. and to have a discussion based on these indicators, building future decision regarding transparency and accountability measures into the government. The document is also useful as a factological and as a reference source in other sectors, related studies that could be interconnected to the transparency and accountability issues. That are made by different think tanks or CSOs, for example, institutional or sectorial analysis at the government, different government levels. Thank you very much, and once again, congratulations for this wonderful event.
Thank you so very much, State Secretary. And now we turn to the Director of Cabinet, Herman Orutaku from Benin. Benin has made great strides on the road to greater transparency, increasing its transparency score by over 60 points from 1 point in 2012 to 65 points in 2021. Benin is now one of the best performers in Africa. What lessons can you share that could help other reform-minded governments to make progress as you have made? Director of Cabinet, please, over to you.
Thank you so much for this question, and I will try to reformulate it if you would allow. I think it's more enriching to speak of experience than of lessons. So I would like to share Benin's experience when it comes to greater budgetary transparency, and we have progressed in 3 areas. First of all, the state of affairs before 2016. Where are we today? And you've already spoken about that, and the actions which enabled us to attain the point where we are at now. Speaking of the situation, in 2015, we had a score of 45 out of 100 in budgetary transparency. The main observation of IABP had to do with the auditing report and another report. Based on the last survey, we had 65 out of 100. And you can see now easily that our country has been publishing since 2019 all of the reports required by the international organization in terms of budgetary transparency. In addition to that, there has been publication of reports such as gender sensibility of the budget, sensitivity to climate change and social areas and so forth. So in all areas of budgetary transparency, we have political will at the highest level because our president, Patrice Talon, announced in 2016 a vast reform program that had to do with reforming public finances and ensuring budgetary transparency. So there have been several aspects to the reforms. I'm going to describe the actions, beginning with the definition of budgetary transparency by Nikes Mede in his work called Public Budgetary Transparency in UMOA. And here we talk about 4 levels of requirement: the initial discussion with citizens, informing the parliament, informing the citizen, and of course, the various accounting requirements. Based on deliberations, there were frameworks established for decision-making with citizens. First, we revised the framework that encouraged civil society participation in the budgetary process. We also looked at the calendar for the budget process to provide more space for discussion for these economic actors during the preparation and publication of the finance law. We opened the budget process to civil society organizations and non-state actors. In this context, there are the main organizations such as Social Works Benin, Sonata, PASIM, and so forth, which were able to participate in the budget process and contributed their various information. We also put in place a dialogue with the private sector, and before preparing the draft law on budgetary and fiscal measures with actors from the private sector, we also put in place a working framework with the affair of local communities, the local municipality association on the measures of interest to them. We also put in place a harmonization framework with social organizations, labor unions, to discuss with them the budgetary proposals. Now, as regards the second area, requirements for information for the Parliament, which aims to make this institution capable of making decisions with the best information possible. We produce regularly information to be able to contribute to the budgetary debate, which opens the last phase of the budget process before June 30th of every year. We talk about budget orientations with the Parliament. We also have the production of all budget documentation with the draft finance law. We have many documents which make it possible for our National Assembly to be able to examine all the information related to the budget and ask questions that are relevant. We also check in on these reports regularly for budget execution. As regards information requirements for citizens, which aims to make financial information accessible to citizens, I can list a few actions that we took. We put in place in 2021 in the context of the project that you know well, Fiscal Openness Accelerator, will finance initiative for fiscal transparency, international budget partnership. With all of these, we put in place an interactive platform with citizens with the Boost Pro tool, and this is a mechanism to promote public participation in the budget process. And this makes it possible to download on individual telephones, Android telephones, and information that makes it possible to program activities. And in 2006, we have an entire unit to focus on budget transparency and communication. And I can say that this unit is devoted to monitoring implementation of the annual plan for improving budgetary transparency and accountability. Another thing that we did in this context was to create an intranet site which is exclusively devoted to periodically publishing financial and budgetary data. This makes it possible for us to systematically publish information required. Something that is special that we did was to translate into national languages main reports on budgetary transparency. I can say in total, there are 8 of our national languages that are the most representative that were used for the translation of documents that we shared with the public. There were also audio programs that were made available on the website for the General Budget Office and on social media. We organized a few times also some fairs on budgetary transparency in the interior of the country. And during these events, participation was such that participants were able to ask questions, and it was a way of spreading and making accessible information through community radio stations. Now, I would like to talk about accountability requirements, specifically related to execution. And we took certain actions. The first action was the operationalization of the Court of Accounts. And this began with the 2019 budget. And in 2020, we operationalized this court. This is the most competent organization in the area of auditing. And we worked with certain financial and budgetary partners. We looked at various evaluation mechanisms to study the quality of financial data. And there were some evaluations carried out by Standard & Poor's and others. We also performed FTA evaluations with the IMF on budgetary and fiscal transparency. We had several iterations of the climate evaluation. We saw successive progress. We were also subjected to USAID evaluations and the World Bank and so forth. And so we were very much engaged, a great deal of political will. We worked with the IMF on various programs. We have just concluded a program with them. So to summarize, among these elements, this will be my conclusion to this question. What was most important in our view was the political will and political support. This political will, which was even more important and necessary, really gave the entire government what was needed to go forward with these reforms with great confidence. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Director of Cabinet Oro Taku, for your insights. And now I have the great pleasure to welcome the Honorable Helen Clark, Goodwill Ambassador for Supreme Audit Institutions, Independence, and former Prime Minister of New Zealand. Our open budget survey shows that while many countries have been able to maintain gains in transparency, legislative oversight is eroding, and in some countries, executive overreach has undermined the impact of independent auditors. These findings are in line with the Intosai Development Initiative Global Stocktaking Report, which found that independence and resource constraints remained an impediment for supreme audit institutions or SAIs. As Goodwill Ambassador for SAI Independence, what are your goals for bolstering the independence of national audit offices? What more can donors and multilateral institutions do to support this agenda? Honorable Helen Clark, over to you.
Well, thanks for the question. And the problems and challenges that you referred to are indeed very real ones. And one of the reasons why Intersai Donor Cooperation has asked me to be a Goodwill Ambassador, as I've worked in this area of transparency and open government for a long time. Of course, in my own country in New Zealand, holding high public office. At UNDP, where encouraging open and good governance and accountability was an important part of the program. Also as chair of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which promotes good governance in that sector. So having well-functioning accountability systems and governance is something that's very, very important to me. And that includes having independent oversight of government budgets and expenditures, which is what supreme audit institutions, of course, do. So what we see is that generally these institutions are performing their roles by conducting audits of government expenditures. And during the pandemic, this became very important. There was a lot of money sloshing around during the pandemic. And some may remember Kristalina Georgieva of the IMF saying, spend what you can to get through this, but keep the receipts. Keeping the receipts is very important for accountability. Supreme audit institutions doing these audits of extraordinary emergency spending is very important. However, The independence of a number of the supreme audit institutions around the world is being challenged. That can range all the way from very direct interference in the work of the audit office. We've seen this recently in Sierra Leone in West Africa, where the Auditor General and her deputy were suspended from their positions shortly before the expected release of their annual audit report. This is clearly very concerning. And then there can be the more subtle interference, but interference nonetheless, in the form of executive control over appointment processes to supreme audit institutions and over their budgets, limiting the resources that they have, limiting their autonomy over their human resource administration, and of course, restricting their access to information. And information is the bread and butter of an independent audit system. Now, we're also seeing that while very important audits may be conducted, they're often not published nor made available to the public. So there's not a lot of use if people don't know about them, because you can't hold people accountable if the information isn't out there. So this has consequences for the extent to which audit recommendations are being followed up, and limits the institution's ability to play their accountability role. A lot of these challenges were exacerbated again during the pandemic, when a number of the institutions saw their budgets reduced, lockdowns impacted on access to information, and fewer audits were published and followed up. Obviously, supreme audit institutions are meant to provide an independent check on how governments manage public funds. I remember this very well from my time in political life in New Zealand. And they have to be independent if they're to be effective. So my job really as the Goodwill Ambassador is to keep raising this issue, to speak up when independence of a supreme audit institution is threatened, and shed light on these conditions that need to be in place to enable them to operate effectively. Now, the INTERSCI donor cooperation is a cooperation between the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions and the development community, including the multilateral and the bilateral donors. They play a role by providing funding and capacity building support to supreme audit institutions. And through that cooperation, supreme audit institutions may be both providers and also recipients of capacity building support. We've heard from Georgia today. The Supreme Audit Institution of Georgia is a good example of an institution that is engaged in various support programs itself, and it shares valuable lessons learned from its own path with other institutions. We also see that independent auditing by the national supreme audit institutions is increasingly being included as a condition linked to loans by the international financial institutions, such as recently with the COVID-19 funding. So again, if funding from an IFI is going to be conditional on having proper checks and accountability, this is something that governments need to very much take to heart. We would also say that having a strong independent audit institution is critical for establishing trust between governments and their citizens. And here we see the role for civil society to be demanding more information from governments, requesting audits, making use of the information that's in them, and lobbying governments to follow up on audit recommendations. I think civil society can also be vocal in support of the independence of the audit institutions. I'll make one more point linked to my hat as board chair of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. The processes of the EITI in each country implementing its standard, which is like a convention, these processes generate a tremendous amount of data. Data about revenue flows, data about contract contents, data about beneficial ownership. And for a supreme audit institution, which is interested in following where the money goes, this data is incredibly important. And we would encourage supreme audit institutions, parliamentary committees, media to be using this information to hold governments to account. That's their function, and we don't like to see the data from our processes underused. We want to see it well used to ensure accountability. Back to you.
Thank you so much for those really important insights. Really very profound, very critical. Since we soon will run out of time, can I ask you all for a lightning round, meaning really brief 2 minutes for each of the speakers. And we would like to ask you, what is next on your agenda as you seek to strengthen and sustain open, inclusive, and accountable budget practices? This is the question for our ministers from the different countries. So can we start with you, Minister José Manuel Vicente Duboc? Give us a sense in 2 minutes on what is next on your agenda to promote open, inclusive, and accountable budget practices.
Yes, I would say there are 4 big things. First of all, to make the budget formulation process more transparent. For the 2nd year in a row here in the Dominican Republic, we have been doing consultations with population on the budget. Second would be strengthening the social participation in the putting together of the budget. Here, together with the Minister of Economy and Planning, we have done citizen consultations in various parts of the territory. For example, in 2022, about 94–95% of the investment projects that have been included in the budget have been the result of a prioritization process that we call the Council of Provincial Development. So it's gone through the province level. And also, we're looking at the budget with the perspective of social inclusion, supporting the development of budgeting reports with a gender focus. And finally, I think we still have to go into more depth on the mechanisms of disclosure of budget information. And these mechanisms that we're thinking about is thinking about launching a website, a portal for fiscal transparency with dashboards that are interactive and understandable so that citizens can have access to the data and be able to manipulate the data as well.
Thank you so very much. Minister Khutsitsvili, over to you, 2 minutes. What is next for you? Minister Khutsitsvili, you're on mute. If you can unmute your mic, thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have the rule-based approach to the PFM reform, which implies we do constantly monitor the reform and depict the solutions in PFF strategy and annual action plans. We have recently finalized PEFA as self-assessment reform 2019-2021, and we have prepared first our gender-responsive PFM self-assessment report. After the validation of PEFA results, it will serve as the basis for the next PFM reform strategy for 2023-2026, as well as recommendations suggested by IBP as part of Open Budget Survey, together with the other instruments we will be using with IMF. The deeper layers of fiscal policy formulation, such as state-owned enterprises reform, fiscal risk management, public investment management and developing domestic markets are fundamental areas of our ongoing and upcoming reform agenda. With the geopolitical challenges, especially for the Georgia and the region, it does never leave room for the pausing on our reform agenda. We have recently submitted responses to EU questionnaire on the candidate for EU membership, and this adds even higher responsibility to the future reform agenda items, which should allow our PFM system compatibility to EU standards. Citizen participation still is a challenge worldwide. Ministry of Finance continue to work on the development of citizens' participation mechanism in the budget planning process. Transparency alone is insufficient for improving our governance. Inclusive public participation is crucial for realizing the positive outcomes associated with the greater budget transparency. In 2019, electronic system of budget transparency and public participation has been officially launched, through which all the citizens have the opportunity to participate in the budget planning process and receive feedback, as well as to get information about budget process and budgeting issues. We are very attentive and responsive to the recommendations coming from our international and bilateral partners. It's our honor to be the member of the GIFT network as steward, and thereby we hope to promote cooperation and exchange of experience between all parties involved to boost the development capacities linked to transparency, participation and accountability in budgetary policy. Ministry of Finance will continue to promote and intensify efforts to improve budget transparency, participation and accountability in the fiscal and budgetary policies.
Thank you so much, Minister. And now, very briefly also, please, State Secretary Arachelov, your take.
We are in the process of updating our framework policy documents like public finance management strategy, like public internal financial control program, development program that will encompass all related assessments and studies, including accountability and transparency. Also PEFA, also your study, and in order to ensure citizens' participation and awareness into the budgeting process. And of course, we will do it through a very transparent and comprehensive consulting process that will ensure, let's hope that there will be described all our decision and all our interventions into this sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, State Secretary. And finally, Director of Cabinet Oro Taku, also please, your take, 2 minutes on what is next.
Thank you so much, Inbin. Our next objective is to decentralize budgetary processes, be even closer to our citizens, to better understand their needs and inscribe them more effectively in the budget process. And we also want to strengthen the citizen side of this budgetary process. We have identified certain actions that are not yet exhaustive. There are 4 so far. We are going to develop accessibility to citizens of municipality budgets. We're going to carry out surveys among the citizens and with CSOs prior to preparing budget reports, and then we will have regular budgetary consultations with our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And finally, Honorable Helen Clark, we have a final question for you to wrap us up, and that is that in a report that IBP and Intersite Development Initiative authored together, we made the case for an all-hands-on-deck approach in which auditors, governments, legislators, and the public should work together to bolster accountability of public spending. What advice would you give to countries that are seeking to build a robust accountability ecosystem? How can we create a virtuous cycle of accountability that promotes collaboration and independence of various oversight actors? Over to you.
Well, following on from what was just said from Benin, I think the engagement of civil society is very, very important. And I know, for example, elsewhere in the world, in Latin America, there are supreme audit institutions which are working to get civil society engaged in what areas are selected for audit, and sometimes even on audit implementation. So if civil society is involved with its voice and advocacy, that may well increase the impact that audits of public expenditure have and lead to an improvement in public service delivery. I think also it would be useful to have more robust accountability and communication and collaboration between oversight institutions. For example, the interaction of parliaments with supreme audit institutions. When I was a member of the New Zealand Parliament, we loved the Audit Office reports. They were the bread and butter of our cross-examination of government ministers and senior officials. And I think for members of Parliament to understand just how powerful this information is in holding governments to account is very important. And by the way, it wasn't only opposition members of Parliament who found it useful, the government members too want to get to the truth of what's happening with public spending. I think at the global level, I'd also stress the importance of cooperation between the different initiatives in the transparency space. You have obviously this open budget survey, very important. You have the Open Government Partnership. You have the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative working on accountability and transparency in the extractive sector. You have this InterSci Supreme Audit Initiative, donor initiative. You have the Kimberley process. I mean, there's a lot of different things in the space. And working together and collaborating and each bringing our perspectives, I think is extremely useful. But congratulations on the open budget survey. I think it's really put more useful information into the public domain about the progress, but also the challenges.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Clark. And now to bring us home, we will hear from the public again. A very quick poll to you, which hopefully will appear on your screen. And that is now, based on today's discussions, this very rich panel that we just have had, the keynote address, the results of the open budget survey. What are your thoughts on open budgets? And the options are, I feel more informed, I am motivated to engage in national policy discussions. I am keen to be part of the call to action, and all of the above. Let's see the results, and not surprisingly so, the public is motivated to do all of the above, to stay more informed, to engage in national policy discussions, and to be part of the call to action. You can see the bars moving on your screen and the results from our poll. Please keep your answers coming. Particularly the all the above and the call to action are highest rated. Thank you so very much for your engagement. Thank you to all of our speakers today. Thank you for the public's engagement. These are truly trying times, but as we cope with crisis, we also see how open and accountable public finance systems are a winning proposition. The results of the OBS and the speakers with us today have reinforced the possibility that a more transparent and accountable world is possible and real gains are achievable. We have heard commitments from governments. The next step is to ensure these are shared at the country level and that governments work hand in hand with all stakeholders to deliver on these commitments. To get there, we have to act collectively. Please join us in continuing this conversation and making this vision a reality. Thank you for your participation today.